know if you're like me, but I have really spent the better part of the last 2 decades trying to stay away from the news. That was my solution. When I was in grad school, I realized pretty quickly that if I was looking at the 10 o'clock news every night and reading the papers every day and seeing the sensationalized versions of bad news all over the place, that it was going to weigh me down when I was already spending or walking into spending 40 hours a week listening to other people's issues and helping them work through them. You see, as a psychologist, you just have to set boundaries. You have to name, these are the things I'll pay attention to, and these ones I can't. And so in choosing the career that I did and knowing that that was going to be emotionally and cognitively taking a lot of my bandwidth, I knew that I was going to have to do something different. So I decided, no news for me. Well, I have a guest today who has a different answer for this. In fact, she's even created her own podcast for it. Julie Rose is here with us. Now, she has been a radio journalist for some time, and she too was getting frustrated by all of what was piling up in this fear-mongering world that we're living in. And I thought she would be a really great guest for us to have on because, I was thinking a couple things. One is women in midlife already, as I've spoken about on this podcast, already are struggling with that stress management. Your biology is changing. And so literally your ability to manage stress is reducing, biologically reducing. Nothing you can do about it. That's just the reality. So I want you to learn how you might show up to this because obviously my second thought was we're heading into an election year. It gets really tricky. And not only that, there has just been in the last few years with COVID and then the explosion of social media and what it does and how it interfaces with us every day, I know that we're about to head into a season again of highly stressful and toxic versions of consuming mass media. So I wanted you to hear it from an expert. She has an idea for us today that will help us to better consume what we want to in the news and get what we need from that information and yet not have it weigh us down emotionally and cognitively the way that it has. So if this subject matter at all interests you, keep listening.
I know your deep, dark secret. You don't like your life. You're a woman in midlife, and for the past 2 decades or more, you've poured yourself in to other people. You've poured yourself into your career, your family, and yet on the inside, you feel broken. And that's no way to be. I'm Dr. Natalie Marr. I'm a clinical psychologist and a life transition expert. It wasn't too long ago that I was in your shoes, waking up in my early 40s, thinking I've got 2 failed marriages, and I'm a single mom for the second time in my life. And I just knew that I could do better, that I could feel better. Fortunately for you, I have about 20 years experience clinically. And so I've created a method that will help you learn to love your story. I know that the story that you're telling yourself about your life feels awful. And I know that you think that you can't change that. I assure you, you can. And when we work together, I'm gonna help you to craft a different story, a story that you love, a story that makes you want to get up every single day. Let's work together to help you love your story.
Are you on my mailing list yet? Because if you're not, you really should be. You want to join at learntoloveyourstory.com. If you scroll down, I'm giving away a freebie for you. Honestly, you know what it is? A free course. I sell online courses, but this is a course just for you. And it's about freeing yourself, letting go of what others' expectations and ideas are for you. You know, that nagging self-doubt in your head, it's usually fueled by your consideration of what others think of you over your consideration of what you think of you. And so I teach you in my video all about what is underlying that kind of self-doubt and how to get out of that conundrum. And I give you a workbook that goes with it that helps you to build the skill sets that you're going to need for that. So please make sure you're on my mailing list, because at the least, you're going to get a free gift. And at the most, you're going to hear about all the things that we're doing on Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving and learntoloveyourstory.com. And you don't want to be missing out on any of the new things that'll be coming your way. Welcome back, everybody. All right. So on Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving today, we have a really special guest. Julie Rose has been a radio journalist for 20 years. She's reported on NPR, local stations, and network shows like Morning Edition and All Things Considered. In 2015, she began hosting a nationally syndicated live interview show on SiriusXM Channel 143 called Top of Mind. But after several years on the air every day, she began fighting the urge to avoid news completely because of how anxious and angry it made her feel. She knew she couldn't be alone in that. So in 2022, a new format for Top of Mind became the answer. Now, a weekly podcast, the show tackles tough topics in a way that's honest and probing, but also leaves people feeling empathic and empowered. So let's welcome Julie to the podcast. So welcome back, everybody, to Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving. And today I have a guest for us that is really going to walk us through how to consume media, how to do it in such a way that it's not adding to our stress levels, but is letting us feel like we're educated enough and able to make educated decisions in what we want to do in our lives, especially in this second act. So Julie Rose, welcome to the podcast. We are so excited to have you.
Dr. Natalie, it's so great to be here. Thanks so much for the invite.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to ask you the question we ask all of our guests. Tell us your story.
Okay. Well, I am a lifelong anxious person.
Then you are in good company, my friend.
I've been medicated since I was about 23, and it works most of the time, but I'm still a very anxious type A, high achiever, perfectionist type. I also am turning 50 this year.
Okay.
And for the last 20 years, I had an early on career change, which was kind of an adventure in my mid-20s, got into public radio reporting, spent the next decade reporting for public radio stations in Salt Lake City and in North Carolina, and I loved it. I was frequently on the network shows like Morning Edition and All Things Considered, and it was... it was my dream job.
Yeah.
I loved it so much. And I was just about hitting, I was kind of late 30s, just about to hit my, kind of like right in my prime, where I could sort of pick my next location. And my parents needed help. They were back home. They were back home in my hometown where I never intended to move back, Provo, Utah. Lovely place. Didn't want to live there.
Yeah.
And they needed help faster than I expected that they would. I'm the oldest child. I'm the only single one. I had the ability, and I had always in the back of my mind known I was going to go back and help them when they needed it. Like I wanted to be able to do that for them.
Right.
So I did. Left my dream job with no idea what might be on the other end, but I believe that God has a plan for me, and I try to follow those promptings. And this was a very clear message that I got that said, you need to go do this now. This is your chance. It's going to be too late. And that was exactly right. So I came back to Provo, Utah without much sense of what my career might be, but I just wasn't worried about that at the moment. Not too long into being back, my father died, and I'm so glad I had been there, to be able to do those things. It was like a confirmation that good thing I came when I did. And not too long into being in my hometown, I found out that my alma mater, Brigham Young University, which is right there in Provo, Utah, had started a 24-hour satellite radio station on SiriusXM. And it wasn't for students, it was for professionals, and they needed good content, and they didn't have anybody who was a journalist on staff. And I was like, whoa, what if we, things work out, right? Blessings from heaven. And so I started hosting a daily live radio show every single day, Monday through Friday for 2 hours. We were live on the radio. We say we, I mean me, plus my engineering team.
Yeah.
Doing live in-depth interviews about everything under the sun. So over the course of 7 years, we did this for 7 years.
Yeah.
I did well over 10,000 interviews during that time about really everything. So we were talking about, I mean, this was 2014 right on through into 2022, right? So we were talking, it was through all these presidential elections. We were talking about climate change. We were talking about all the big issues, anything that was going on in Afghanistan and in Africa and in the United States, and climate change and environmental stories and politics and culture and kind of all of it, right?
Yeah.
I got to towards the end of those 7 years, and I came to another crisis because I just couldn't bear to consume the news anymore.
I know.
I was harboring this kind of secret shame, honestly, because I'm a journalist. I should be like thriving on this, you know? And I had gone from being the kind of person who my alarm clock was set to the radio and would wake me up to the news headlines every morning, right? And then I'd crank it way up so I could get in the shower and, you know, still hear the news. I had gone to news at every moment to news only when I absolutely had to for work. And mostly I was resentful of the fact that I had to do it for work.
Yeah.
And so then I was like, well, what am I going to do? Like change careers?
Yeah.
You know, what am I going to do? I'm 45, you know, at this
Yeah.
point. Like, it's a little late to change careers. I mean, I know it's never too late, but there wasn't anything else I could imagine wanting to do. But I also did not want to do the news anymore. And so I kind of sat on this for like a year and in panic. And one day I was reading the newspaper because I have to for my job. And a headline grabbed me that said, "I'm a journalist and I avoid the news. You know, I don't want to consume the news." And I was like, hang on. Somebody's admitting this. So I immediately clicked in and read, and it was by a journalist who's done war reporting and who's written a couple of books. Her name is Amanda Ripley, and she pointed out that news avoidance is actually very, very common. So it was at that point that I realized that I found out that 40% of Americans, this is based on the Reuters International Journalism Research Institute that they have, 40% of Americans, close to 40% of us, actively avoid the news, either all of the time or at certain times, or actively avoid news about certain topics. And that was just like a huge relief for me.
Yeah.
I realized, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not the only journalist. If she can admit it, so can I. And then the next question was, all right, well, what do I do about that? Right. And some of the reasons we can talk about in a minute why people avoid the news. For me, it was that it felt depressing and emotionally draining and oftentimes felt polarizing and divisive. Like, you know, everything just felt like it had an agenda. Just like, it's just a lot. Like, it seemed like everywhere I turned, things were happening, big things that I couldn't control and that were bad. And it was just like not good for a person with anxiety. Yeah. And those are some of the same reasons that a lot of other people avoid the news. But I also felt like avoiding the news entirely just wasn't the answer for me. Maybe it is for some people, but for me, you know, it didn't feel right to be in my little bubble where I didn't know what was going on in the world, and therefore I couldn't have conversations about it. Yeah. I couldn't engage on the topics that really mattered to me, and it felt very passive. Like I couldn't be, you know, at this stage in my life, I'm embedded in a community. I'm a leader in my congregation. People in the neighborhood, I'm older than a lot of them now at this point. They look up to me, you know, kids in the neighborhood, you know, see me as a sage, right? And I have this public platform, and it just didn't feel like I could not engage. But the question was, how do I do it then? How can I engage in the news? There are a lot of reasons why the news is the way it is and why it feeds to us a lot of bad news and a lot of polarization. I'm just one journalist. I can change the way I do it, but I'm not going to fix the problem for the rest of the industry. So could we create a podcast? It just so happened that at that very moment, my management said, hey, maybe we're done with the daily live radio show. And I was like, oh thank so God. Much. Because I'm exhausted.
A breath of fresh air.
I'm just about to I was burning out every 3 months. Like, I can't do this anymore. And so they said, why don't you reimagine, what would you do as a podcast? And I was like, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could do a weekly or a semi-weekly podcast that took one of these tough topics, each week. And we did a deep dive in a way that would leave people feeling empathetic and empowered. And we're not going to dance around it. We're not going to just it's not a good news show. We're going to take the tough topics, racism and immigration and, all of the stuff around culture wars and environment and sort of things that matter, things that are top of mind, which is the name of the podcast, but that also we tend to want to avoid because of how they make us feel or how it's so hard to find news that really informs us without inflaming our emotions. So could we make it interesting? Could we focus on human stories? Could we find perspectives that could be surprising instead of just feeling like we were being preached at, either to the choir or against us,
Yeah.
So that's what we've set out to do. So we've been doing the podcast now. It's become both an answer and to the problem. It's my little offering to the world, our team. It's called Top of Mind with Julie Rose, where we want people to feel a little challenged, to get practice exposing themselves to perspectives that they don't normally, engage with, and to come away feeling optimistic. Seeing that maybe there are solutions. So there are some ways that they can approach the problem or things that they can do. There's a next step personally, even if it's just going to have a conversation or reading a book. Yeah. So that's how I landed where I am today. And it just so happens that in the process, I've cracked the code to consuming the news in a way that will uplift me and empower me rather than, overwhelm and depress me.
Right. And the psychologist in me is exploding because what you just described, that it's that empowerment piece that I think is so key. You have to leave people with something that can be done, because one of the features in psychology that we're noticing is we weren't wired for this. We weren't wired to know at any given moment what was happening here in the 20 or 30 people in our tribe, right? And the 8 billion other people in other tribes all across the earth. That is not how our human psyche was wired. And so technology has leap yeared way ahead of where our own human biology is allowing us. And one of the features of that is that we just feel helpless. You're watching this, you're consuming this, and then you're left with, and I can do nothing about this, which is really, that's kind of at the heart of what causes all of us to have those depression or anxiety symptoms, essentially, is that helplessness feeling. So that is brilliant. I was, in my intro to today's podcast, I shared with my listeners that 20 years ago when I decided to, well, not 20 years ago, I guess it's much longer ago when I decided to be a psychologist. But anyway, 20 years ago when I was really going into practice headlong, I decided to stop consuming any news. I had people in my life that would tell me kind of the highlights of things. And this was ahead of social media being such that you would never miss something. I could miss things. I could definitely miss things, but I had to kind of make this decision in my life of, if I'm going to consume 30 to 40 hours a week of helping other people through difficult times in their lives, that's a huge cognitive load. I can't also consume this other thing that's happening in the news media that's more, like you said, it's more sensationalizing kind of the negative than looking at the balanced way of what's happening in humanity. It's really focusing in on a very narrow scope of what's happening in humanity. I had to just let it go. And yet, as social media has exploded, and as, since the 2016 election and beyond, how divisiveness has really started to get even more icky for the first time in my adult life, I can say. I'm not sure if that's everybody's lived experience, but it has been mine. I want to be informed. And I have to balance that out, how much of a cognitive load that I can do. So I was really excited to have you on the podcast today to tell us how you've cracked that code.
Yes. Well, it's so interesting to me that you say, look, because now you could say, I don't consume the news. I never open a newspaper, and I don't turn on cable news at night. I don't watch the evening news. You could totally do that and also feel like you know what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
And how is that possible? Well, it's because of social media. It's because there is so much information going around that it's very, very easy to be a passive consumer of the news. And in fact, this is another really interesting finding from that the Reuters Journalism International News Institute, where they study that passive news consumption is the one category that is on the rise. And passive news consumers are also especially likely to be news avoiders. Here is the problem. Yes. So here's the problem. Like, there is no way to avoid knowing what's going on in the world because people are going to talk about it. And the majority of people right now, the biggest source of news, people say, oh, yeah, I consume the news. Where do you get it? Facebook, social media, Instagram. That's where I get my news. I can totally understand that because that is an easy way for you to not have to expend effort.
Yes.
And you can think that it's using less cognitive load, but think about how every time one of those stories comes along your feed, what the reaction is, what it feels like to you. Unfortunately, it would be awesome if the Apple News app and Facebook if the algorithms were designed to feed you a range of topics that would expose you to things outside of your own bubble that would be complicated and nuanced. And that is just not what we respond to on social media. And it is not the way the algorithms are built because they need engagement and they want you to feel big things. And so the first thing that I did was realize how much of my consumption, even when I was avoiding the news, quote unquote, was passive. And that was fueling this sense of helplessness and overwhelm and negativity because I wasn't getting a balance. I wasn't in control in any way. And I wasn't being mindful about what I was consuming. Right. And instead, I was just sort of leaning back, pretending that I was avoiding while this fire hose of stuff designed to amplify my feelings and make me feel scared and make me afraid of the other side and all of these things. So the first thing I encourage people to do is limit your consumption of the news on social media. Okay. I disable the News for You apps on my phone. On the Apple News, I disable those because those, again, they're algorithm driven and they're not a balanced view of the world. And the more you click on things, the more they're going to feed you things exactly like you've already clicked on. Yes. So any kind of news feed that is algorithm based, I try to avoid that. I used to follow a lot of news organizations on social media, like on Facebook and stuff, different like NPR stories or New York Times. I went and unfollowed all of them because I don't want. Social media is not a good place for me to get my news. No. Social media has other values. I'm going to use it for human connection. I'm going to use it to discover new podcasts. I'm going to use it to, talk about my podcast, all those things. I'm going to use it for social connection. I'm not going to use it for my news consumption. Okay, now that means, well, now I have to work. I have to go consume the news. Are you telling me, lady, that I have to subscribe to a newspaper and, get ink on my hands and read no, thank you. Look, I have not touched a newspaper with actual newsprint in probably 8 years. I do not do that. But so the next thing I have to do is, all right, I'm going to make my news consumption mindful. What would my consumption of the news have to look like? What would it look like for it to be more productive and feel healthier? Here's what I want to feel when I'm getting informed. I want to feel calm, no yelling or condescending or amplifying my fears. I want to feel optimistic. I want to, if there is progress being made, I'd like to know that. I'd like that to be part of the story. I like to be surprised. I do not like to have surprise parties. I don't like surprises in my environment, Natalie, but I love those moments of surprise and discovery in storytelling.
Sure, absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
I
what
didn't see that coming. I did not see that coming. I wouldn't have expected this kind of person or this person of political persuasion to think this way or to say that or, oh, that's an interesting twist, right? I like that stuff. So I would like that to be part of my news consumption. I want to feel empathetic. So human stories. I want to understand people's experiences rather than just have people tell me how I should think and rather than just hearing pundits with opinions tell me their opinions. I want to hear from people who have skin in the game. Who are personally affected by the issue. And I want to feel empowered. And that's not that I know how to solve the problem now. Okay, climate change, I got this, right? No, I want to come away from the story feeling like there is a next step for me.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Feeling like, and that next step might be, gosh, I need to do some more reading on this topic because I really don't understand the underlying issue. Or, wow, I never really thought about that perspective. So I'm going to go seek out more of those perspectives. Or, I think I'm going to ask a different question when it comes time for the city council elections. I'm going to focus on something different when I vote.
Yep.
I'm going to look for answers to this question in my candidates when I listen to the debates or whatever. I am going, this is my favorite. I've actually never talked about this topic with this person in my life who now I'm realizing probably has some personal experience with this, or probably has been affected in some way, or probably sees it pretty differently than me because of their life experience.
Yeah.
And I never really thought about that before. Now I'm really curious. I want to go have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'm looking for in my news consumption. And that's what we try to do with Top of Mind, not coincidentally,
not at
the
all,
stories
I'm sure.
that we put together.
Yeah.
So what I realized was that my next step then, the next thing I needed to do was go out and start choosing what I was consuming and doing it more mindfully. I recommend that people, try to make sure that there's in your consumption mix, that there is some local news sources, because local news tends to be less polarizing. It tends to be more empathetic, and it's closer to home. And it's going to help you understand the people who are in your most immediate circle. So even though it's really hard to find local news a lot these days, because so many of them are going away, subscribe to your local paper if you've got one, or subscribe to them digitally, something to support local news, to keep you grounded and connected. National news is so often just about the big presidential horse races, or it's about the polarizing stuff going on in Congress. And guess what? What's happening in your local city council is way more impactful for most of us.
Way more impactful, and you have way more agency in that smaller arena.
I can go to the next meeting, or I can call my council member. They're probably going to take my call, whereas my congressman, unlikely. Okay?
Exactly.
I mean, somebody will answer
Probably
the phone when I call my congressman, but I probably won't get him on the phone.
Right.
And then the next, so limit your consumption on social media of news. Rebalance to make sure you're including some local, and go deep rather than stay broad and shallow. So choose one topic, and you could do this a couple of ways. But what I have found sometimes is, because it's just overwhelming, I'm like, what am I going to read today? Sometimes, so for example, when the war broke out between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza, I was like, I need to do some reading here to better understand what's happening here. And so I spent a good couple of weeks where most of my in-depth consumption was those stories, was seeking out stories to help me understand that. Same thing when the Ukraine war broke out a couple of years ago. Or maybe it's related to something in your local community, or it's a political issue. Maybe it's the border. I've spent weeks reading stories about what's going on at the border to try to, and looking for new information that could expand my understanding, looking for more personal stories, looking for first-person reports, kind of all of that, right? Yeah. So you can pick one topic that matters to you and go deep rather than go shallow.
Sure.
But the main thing that I realized, and this was kind of a light bulb moment for me, one day, so I have a couple of newspapers that I go to on a regular basis on their websites, and I don't know when this happened, but it's been in the last couple of years that you could go to a newspaper's website, just about any of them, but especially I'm thinking about like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. If you go to WashingtonPost.com, you'll see the headlines, and you can start scrolling and keep scrolling and keep scrolling. And it never ends. Oh. It's like an endless. It has become, a lot of companies, but especially news outlets, have turned their homepages into kind of the endless news feed that we're used to on social media, where you actually will never stop scrolling. And I would catch myself. I still get sucked into this sort of scrolling, that we're so trained to do until, an hour has gone away. And I have literally just been scrolling through, reading headlines and first little teaser lines for 40 minutes. And what is the effect that has had on me? So I've just spent, let's say I budgeted 40 minutes really to kind of do my news consumption for the day. Maybe it's just 20 minutes. Well, you can spend, what have I gained by scrolling a couple of new, feeds off of these newspaper websites for 20 minutes. Well, I certainly haven't gained a lot of deeper understanding. I've come away. Headlines are designed to catch your attention. We are drawn into conflict.
Yeah.
We are drawn to stuff that confirms our worldview. And, you know, we're drawn to big emotions. And so, so if my consumption is scrolling the headlines on a newspaper website for 20 minutes, I'm coming away feeling more overwhelmed without any sense as to the improvements that are being made. And I haven't actually learned anything.
No.
So.
And you've excited your nervous system, you know, times 20 instead of times 2 in a deep way where you could walk away better understanding it and maybe even having an idea of what you could do in your little sphere, you know, corner of the world.
And so here's my hack. I realized one day that I'm like, I'm just scrolling. And now I don't know what to pick. And it's like when I sit down to watch a movie on Netflix and then I spend 2 hours reading through Netflix movie summaries without actually watching anything. Right. I felt like a lot of my news consumption was the same way, just like reading the one-liner headlines. And then I realized, I'm like, all right, I'm just going to pick something. Well, this seems interesting. And then I would click on it. And then I would read the headline, the little summary nut that they have. And then I'd read, you know, maybe a paragraph, 2 paragraphs. And I'd be like, this is boring. Or I don't like that perspective. Or, I already know this stuff. Or, you know, or I'm confused here. I don't understand what's going on. And then I would click away and go pick something else. So effectively, I've traded reading the summaries of the Netflix for watching the first 2 minutes of movies, which I also do a lot of. And then I turn it off and then I go pick something else. And I actually am not. And I realized one day I was like, Julie, when's the last time you read a whole article top to bottom? Like ever? What about you? Have you? I'm a whole news article, like from the first word to the very end.
Almost never. What I can tell you is scientific journals, that's a little bit different, but I'm doing it for a different reason. And now that you name that, I go into the scientific literature the very same way that you're describing how we should go into the news. You're looking for a specific subject that you want to know more about, and you're scanning only to find articles that are in that genre and then choosing some that you go and read the whole article.
And then you read it and you need to understand what you're not skipping over the methodology section because that matters and you understand that it matters. You're not skipping over, you know, you're not like me and jumping to the conclusions because you don't understand statistics anyway and you're just hoping that they'll explain it in plain language, but you get it. And so you're like consuming. And I realized that with my news consumption here, because I know this, right? I'm a journalist. I know that we are, you know, we're trained to catch your attention at the beginning, but then there's going to be a lot of nuance that I can't throw at you in the first 2 paragraphs.
Exactly.
Because I need to catch your attention. And I'm hoping that you'll stay with me when we get into the nuance. But the fact of the matter is that I just spent, you know, I don't know how long, maybe a year working on this investigative report. And there is so much important information that you need to know as a listener. And you're not going to get it if you only read the first 3 paragraphs of my story. That's just the facts. And we are so trained because of short attention spans. We have trained ourselves to just like skim through everything and just kind of read quickly stuff and not. And so the hack for me has been, this has become a practice where I say, all right, I'm picking one story. I'm going to read the whole dang thing. I don't care if I get halfway through and I'm bored. I don't care. It is an exercise. It's an exercise as much as it is an opportunity to learn something.
Yes.
And what it's taught me is to be a lot more aware of the moment at which I want to bail out and to stop and think about that. Okay. What I've noticed is that I frequently want to bail out when I feel like the story no longer fits the narrative I had in my head. Well, that's not good.
No.
Because the whole point of I want to be surprised.
Yeah. You don't want to be in that echo chamber of only feeding yourself.
I'm trying to break out of that in my consumption so that I don't feel trapped in my echo chamber.
Yes.
So that I don't feel trapped in this, like, everybody who's a good person thinks the way I do and all the people who are bad think the other way. Okay. So if the moment I read something that doesn't align with my worldview and challenges me, I stop reading, well, you know, that's a me problem. Okay, so that's interesting. Going to file that away, recognize that I have that tendency, and I'm going to keep on reading. And then I'll get to another point. I'm confused here. I don't understand who all these players are. Okay, well, that's interesting. That either means that this is a poorly written article, which maybe is possible, or it means that but you know what? There are plenty of things that are poorly written that I work really hard to understand. Like, I mean, I'm not going to say the Bible is poorly written, but it's not easy to understand.
It's not easy to understand. No, scripture usually is not.
I'm willing to work at it. Okay. So I can do this. I can figure this out. I had to read James Joyce in college. Like, I know I can get through this.
Yep.
And what am I going to lose? 10 minutes of my life? Like, this is small, but I'm working this muscle. And also, it may signal to me that it's a more complicated issue than I thought it was.
Yes.
Because I realize how much I crave simplicity.
Yes.
Okay, that's another thing to file away. I have a bias for simplicity. I have a bias for clear good and bad stories. It's why we like superhero shows, right? Because there's a clear good guy and a bad guy.
Yep.
And I also notice frequently that when I hear a perspective that I just really disagree with, so either it doesn't fit my worldview, or somebody is saying something that I find that I'm just like, how could you think that? That seems so stupid. I have those reactions too, and I'm like, I don't want to read this anymore because they're quoting this person, and that seems totally dumb, right?
Yeah.
So those are my main triggers that I realize make me want to jump out. And then there's a final one, and that is that I feel like I already know everything there is to know. I'm like, all right, I got the idea.
Yep.
Yep. I'm impatient. I'm going to move on. That is another. I notice
that's dangerous.
It's an impatient. It's my impatience coming through.
Yeah.
And I'm trained to consume 60-second TikTok reels. Right.
Right.
That's coming through, and the only way I am going to get to a place where I am experiencing the things I want to experience from my news consumption is if I allow for the opportunity to in a calm situation where I have to lean in a little bit, where I'm being asked to feel some empathy, to feel a little surprise, and to allow myself to be challenged and recognize that I'm okay. That this is like, my threat response is rising, but it doesn't, I'm safe.
Yes.
I'm just reading a news article. I can make the decision if indeed I truly am safe, if I'm not experiencing sort of like PTSD and there are some things that I can't read because it creates that. And I'm like, you know what? This is not one of those things that I'm going to consume. But a lot of the time I'm bailing out just because I feel uncomfortable and there's no reason for it. And the value of all this, I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts before I go any further. But there's like a whole payoff here that has just been so exciting to me about rearranging my consumption this way.
Well, one of the things that stands out to me most through that whole thing is the mindfulness core to how you're coming at this. It's a concept that I've talked about on this podcast. It's a concept that I actually teach first in my group coaching packages and with my online courses because of the value of what mindfulness does for us. It keeps us attuned from the inside out instead of from the outside in. And it's that outside in orientation that can get us overwhelmed pretty quickly. And it turns on in our own biology, the fight, flight, or freeze, fall reflex, because why? We have to get away from the big bad lion, right? But you don't want your body consuming everything it does in its path as something that is a threat. You don't want it to pick up the social media and already turn itself on. And that's what human biology will do, is that over time, it develops these, you said biases, right? It develops these kind of shorthand ways of doing things where it's going to bore you halfway through that article. If it's not in the echo chamber, it's going to tell you things like, you already know what's up. You've got the gist of this. All geared at, it only wants to scan your environment and keep you safe from threat, and it's not helping you thrive in your life. And this is really the transition that I want people to have in midlife in particular, is to go from this survival mode, human psyche biology into living thrival mode. You have to be mindful and you have to be oriented inside out. So you have to be more thinking about the cues of, what do I notice in my body and my mind when I get halfway through this article and and I want to put it down? What's that about? And is it about what's in the article and my body wants to push that away? Is it about, that my body doesn't want to just spend time in one thing, that it's trying to just do that scanning thing? Well, guess what? I don't want to do that. I don't want to be in survival mode all the time. I don't want my body mind to get the idea that my life is a threat that I'm like gearing up for every single day when I get out of bed. I want to be like so excited when I fall asleep to wake up the next day and get started. And so much of the depression, anxiety, and those rates are going up considerably for women between ages of 40 and like 55. In fact, we kind of race with the young adults for who's in the lead as to how much depression that we have. That's sad. Like, this is not a game. This is not a race I want people to be in. And so, the thing that you're talking about that really it was poignant for me is the mindfulness piece is key. And there's elements of how you're doing that, both in like sitting down with a article, but it's also, deciding what you're going to be consuming and pushing out the things that are competing for your interest and training your mind to come back to, no, I decided and I decide that these are the things that I'm going to be paying attention to.
Exactly. And that what I realized was how much of my behaviors around news and around these important issues in my life or in my community that I wanted to engage in, but was the reason that I was avoiding them, that I was frequently not having important conversations or just like not bothering to engage and sort of learn to it's the fear of being uncomfortable that I wasn't comfortable being uncomfortable. I didn't know how to, I haven't had practice.
Right.
We are so, and I look around my world and I'm like, most of the people I interact with are very similar to me in terms of their life stage, in terms of their, it's one of the reasons I value my church community because it's a place where I get a little bit more exposure to more, at least, diversity of life stage and kind of, political persuasion and so forth. But I realized that one of the really exciting takeaways for me was realizing that if I consumed news in this way, that I could get better. I could feel more confident going into an environment where instead of reading a news article that was voicing perspectives that challenged me, that I could actually sit in the presence of someone who was voicing perspectives that challenged me.
Yes.
And not just shut it down, which is the equivalent of stopping reading, and not just, lash out, which is the equivalent of me yelling at the TV or sort of being like, but my view is this, I'm going to go read something that I agree with, right? I realized that this could actually be really safe, regular practice, exercise, so that when I encounter a perspective that I disagree with, when I'm face to face with someone and I can tell that we have a different point of view and we're sitting next to each other at the church picnic and someone says, something about, and I could all of a sudden tell like, oh gosh, we have different views on race, or we have different views on economic inequality, or man, that was kind of a statement that I don't know about that. Instead of all of a sudden judging them like, all right, well, I'm never going to talk to that yoo-hoo because they're definitely, a bad person, and kind of having all the judgments, I can turn to them. And if the moment's right, I can try to learn more. I can ask the question that I wanted to have answered when I was reading the news article, and I can say, "So, I'd really like to better understand your perspective. I think you maybe know that I think we see this differently, but I really would like to better understand. Would you mind not tell me how you can believe that, or why would you say such a thing, or don't you know that X, Y, and Z?" I can say, My whole goal is to better understand. I'm gonna work this muscle a little bit, this like curiosity muscle, and ask, would you be willing to share with me something you've experienced in your life that has shaped your view on this issue?
Yeah.
I'm not really trying to understand what their view is so much as where they've been in their life that has helped them to hold this view so that I can better understand them as a person and what might lead someone, and to see them as a human rather than as the caricature in my mind that I've worked up as everybody who believes this way on this issue is clearly, a bad person, a racist person, selfish person, whatever all the things are, right? That I might have put in my head. So for me, what this has become, and I realized as I was consuming, when it started to happen a couple of times where I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard these perspectives before. I've heard parts of these perspectives before. And I've taken the time to read the whole article many times and seen these perspectives. I feel a little more empowered to be able to have this conversation and just to be comfortable exploring. Like, I'm curious. I'm not trying to change their mind. I'm not looking to change my mind. but I'd like to better understand. And that's the beginning of bridging the polarization that we're experiencing.
Absolutely. Absolutely it is. And like you couldn't have done that had you not started to teach your body and mind not to be uncomfortable.
Trained it.
And run away as soon as it is uncomfortable. And that there is something really true about how the way that news media and social media is working right now. It does make us not want to have those conflicts in person. It's okay if we shoot it out into the, non-humanized world of I'll respond on, my social media feed to this, but I won't necessarily say it in person.
I'm too chicken to even have the arguments on social media, but I will happily watch other people having the arguments and be like, oh yeah, like, what is that?
Yeah.
It's conflict addiction or something.
It is a conflict. It's a chaos addiction. And there is some neurochemistry to that. Like there is something behind that. That's why we, jump out of planes when we have no business or need to. We just, want the thrill of it. Why we create roller coasters and amusement parks. So there is some science that supports, there is something to that. And the true disservice is then we're too scared to do things in person that actually could better both of us, in that small conversation, that we would both understand each other. And build empathy, not necessarily consensus, but build empathy for one another, which is huge.
We go in. I think that's a perfect point that so much of the battles that we see, whether it's the presidential debates or it's the people sniping at each other online or it's the back and forth, we're going to cancel you, you're going to cancel us, whatever. So much of that is really, it's not geared towards understanding. It's geared towards owning the other side, towards winning somehow. It's a sporting match, right? And the reality is that there's never going to be any consensus if you're trying to win. Right. And yet we don't know how to be any other way. We're taught that's the way that you fight the good fight, is to try to own the other person in some kind of a debate. And I am terrified that if I get into one of those conversations, they're going to own me. Like I'm not quick enough on my feet to always have all the answers. And so then I'm like, well, forget it. I'm not having this conversation. But if I completely reframe the goal, and the goal is not to make my own point at all, it is simply to understand so that I can have more clarity about my own view or feel some new empathy. And that'll probably, by the way, make me a better advocate for the things that matter to me. Yeah. Whether it's in debate or whether it's just in the way I spend my time in my community and the kinds of things I vote for, there is value in simply listening. Hearing, absolutely, staying uncomfortable long enough to get to another place. In fact, I have to tell you, Natalie, I'm so excited because we've been doing this series of conversations on Top of Mind where we see what this looks like in daily life. We call it stick with it moments, where somebody tells us about a time when they encountered a perspective or a situation. Maybe it was in reading an article, maybe it was sitting face to face with somebody. Doesn't have to be political. Maybe it was getting some tough feedback, and we're like, that's not, but then, okay, maybe I need to just kind of sit with this. Maybe it was signals in our own life that were going on, or maybe it's a situation where we find ourselves for the very first time, like we're really out of our depth here. This feels really uncomfortable to me. And the instinct is to flee or to fight. Right? Maybe freeze. But we choose with the, either intentionally or somehow we muster the magical mindfulness to stay, to stick with the discomfort, to just be in it, to stay curious, to stay open and see what happens. Yeah. We've been doing these conversations and it's so exciting to see how this skill can work in tiny little ways throughout our lives where we have the opportunity to lean in just a little bit and learn something or get stronger, get more capable. And so the thing I'm excited about is that we are spinning these conversations off into their own podcast. It's going to be called Uncomfy. Sticking with I'm going to get uncomfy with people. Hearing stories. We're going to launch it in mid-July. Really, really exciting. Where every single week we're going to have the story of big or small, a real life moment where somebody chose, I'm not going to do the easy thing. I'm not going to bail out. I'm not going to lash out. I'm going to stay. I'm going to stick with it and see what comes of it. And it's not about sticking to my guns. It's about staying humble. It's about staying uncomfortable.
Yes.
So
yes.
yeah, there's so
Humility.
much to learn when you
That's
start
a great way
looking
to
for those stories.
Yeah. I like that frame though, that humility, because that's what we're looking for, is just to, hold space for, I don't know all the things, and let me just stay curious in this moment a little bit, that I might see something different, hear something different, feel something different if I stay in the discomfort for a little bit longer. I love that. So one of the thoughts I had as you were talking about these uncomfortable moments is, for women in midlife, one of our telltale survival mode responses is people pleasing. It's something that we're acculturated to do, like conflict is scary. And our job is to either preemptively make sure there's no conflict that ever arises, or when conflict arises, to squelch it as soon as possible through this people pleasing behavior. Any thoughts on or advice for someone that wants to kind of push past that, wants to be a little bit uncomfortable, how to start, how to even begin?
Yes. Oh, so first of all, read the book High Conflict.
Okay.
It is so interesting. It's a book by Amanda Ripley, who happens to have been the reporter who wrote that article that caught my attention a couple of years ago, news avoidance. And so she has this book called High Conflict, Why We Get Stuck and How to Get Out. And the whole premise, when I first read it a couple of years ago, just completely, it like blew the top of my head off, because it had never occurred. I am a conflict avoider. It had not occurred to me that conflict could be good. That there could be such a thing as healthy conflict, because I'm either an avoider or an appeaser, or I'm going to fight. And in each of those, like there are, I think, I don't know, there's kind of a conflict framework. I'm going to get it wrong, but there's avoiding, there's appeasing, there's aggressor. And then, there's like compromise, which also feels icky. And then there is one called collaboration, which is kind of what Amanda Ripley calls healthy conflict.
Yeah.
So this is a place where, if we don't have conflict, we're not actually making progress, because conflict is simply the result of differing opinions. It's how things get done. It's how we push into new territory. Contention, if we approach the conflict in anger or in fear, then it's more likely to slip into one of these less ideal situations. So in terms of having specific conversations where we're worried that it's going to turn into unhealthy conflict, that it's going to be a bad conflict kind of situation. A couple of things that have worked for me, and some things that I learned from Amanda Ripley's book and from Monica Guzman's book, which is I Never Thought of It That Way. And she talks about having difficult conversations in dangerously divided times. So a couple of things. First of all, once I've done, one of the things that helps me a lot is to sort of prepare by reading news articles that I really, really actively disagree with. So sometimes my hack is that instead of just reading any old news article top to bottom, I'm going to pick the opinion piece in the newspaper that I most disagree with. Like there's always going to be one where I'm like, I'm not even going to read that from the headline. I can tell I don't agree. I'm like, guess what? That's my job today. I'm going to read this one top to bottom, every single word, and I'm going to notice how I feel. And I'm going to continually ask myself in every moment where I feel like, how could somebody think this? I'm going to ask myself instead, what might have happened in this person's life? What might this person have experienced that could lead them to hold this position?
Yes.
What could I be missing here?
Yes.
What might have blind spots? Looking for clues about the things in their life that might have led them to this perspective is a way to practice doing what I need to do when I'm sitting face to face with somebody. So,
it is.
So I'm in a situation.
That's a great key, practice ahead of time.
Yeah,
I like that.
It's a little bit of prep. And then, so then I'm going to go into the conversation, and this probably doesn't apply as much. I guess it could to any kind of conflict, but some of the keys that I found, and usually these are conversations with people about topics that matter, but I don't know how to broach with them, so there are a lot of topics in my family that we just don't talk about, and I'm like, that doesn't seem good. I wish we could have those conversations. You have to do it gently. I think it's important when you're trying to begin to have these conversations. I think it's important to ask permission. I think it's important to kind of establish and to make clear your intentions, and then to really uphold, to be honest about those, to have integrity when it comes to your goals.
Yes.
So I need to know up front that my goal here in this particular situation is, this is my neighbor who has this opposing political party sign in their front lawn, and it bothers me that they are supporting this candidate, but I feel like we should talk about it.
Yeah.
Maybe they even know that I disagree, right? And so it's become this thing for us. And we could avoid it and just smile and give each other cookies occasionally when we have leftovers, or we could have a conversation. And I'd like to have that conversation because I would like to deepen this relationship, because we share a property line. And, I care about these people, but I don't understand them very well, because now I see this sign and I'm like, how could they be those kind of people? I thought they were good people.
Yeah.
So find an opportunity to invite a conversation. And when I'm going in, I'm keeping in mind that I'm not trying to persuade them to no longer support that candidate. My goal is very clearly to better understand them as people that I care about. Well, if that's my goal, then it doesn't really matter what my view is, because I'm not trying to. So that means I'm going to be focused on asking questions rather than making my argument. And that means that when I go into this conversation, once I've said, hey, would you mind, I notice you have this sign. I feel differently, but these are really important issues, and I really respect you, and I'd like to better understand your position and some of the reasons why you're supporting this candidate. Would you be willing to just have a short conversation with me? I'm just looking to better understand. All right.
Yeah.
And maybe they'll say yes. And then if they do, then my questions are all going to be focused on, why do you think this person, they're not questions about like, why this, or what about this, but what about this position, or aren't you bothered about this with this candidate or this party? The questions are entirely focused on trying to understand how my neighbor has come to hold their perspective. What has influenced their decision to support this candidate?
Yeah.
So it'll be, would you share an experience with me? This is my very favorite one. It's, would you share an experience with me that has shaped your view on this? Maybe they'll tell me how, they've had this experience economically and they feel like this candidate's going to be better. Or maybe they'll tell me that they're really concerned about this particular social moral issue, and that's why this candidate matters to them. And then my follow-up question is going to be, oh, well, tell me more about that. The minute I feel like I don't know what to say because I'm having all these emotions, tell me more. When in doubt. Tell me more. Tell me more. And the longer I ask these questions, the more, where it's truly just about trying to better understand. The other trick you can do, and this is something probably you're well trained at, but it's something that mediators do. It's called looping, where I'm not just hearing what they're saying, but I'm affirming to them that I'm hearing it and giving them the opportunity to correct a little bit.
Yes.
So really what I'm doing, for women who are afraid of conflict, what we're afraid of is what's going to result from it. We're afraid that we're not going to be able to control the situation, that we're going to break something, that we're not going to be able to, that we're going to ruin this relationship.
Yeah.
Well, there is nothing to ruin if all I'm doing is coming into this relationship to build, coming into this conversation to help this other person be heard and seen. And at the same time, I'm going to learn a few things.
Yes.
Which is great. And so the looping is very simply just kind of hearing what they're saying and then repeating back to them in a very gracious way. Not like, what I'm hearing you say is that you're a racist because of X, Y, and Z, but saying, so what I'm hearing you say is that because that you've had some economic experiences, or you've had some struggles as a small business owner, and that has led you, and that you think that this candidate's political party is going to be more supportive of that. And then they'll say, yes, that's exactly right. Or they'll say, well, no, actually what I really mean is this.
Yeah.
And then I'll say, okay. And then I'll restate it. Does that sound right?
Yes.
And I keep restating it until I get it right. And it may seem like this is taking a ton of time and pointless, but what I'm actually doing is giving these tiny little positive emotions. Everybody loves to be heard and seen.
Yes.
And I'm giving them tiny little positive emotions that are lifting the level of this experience.
Yes.
Maybe to the point where they'll be a little bit more forthcoming with me. And then I'll really get to the bottom of why it is that they are, of what has shaped their view.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll open up a little bit more. Even better, maybe they'll want to know where I'm coming from.
Yeah, exactly.
And then maybe they'll be like, well, what do you think? And instead of me jumping right in and saying, well, I think you're wrong because of X and Y and Z, now I need to respond in kind by saying, by sharing an experience from my own life that has shaped my view. I support this, or I have chosen not to support this candidate because of this thing that I've experienced in my life that makes it really difficult for me to, that means that I don't trust politicians who have done this. I've been a victim of this, and so then this, or I feel really strongly that this, and not even I feel strongly, but it needs to be focused on a life experience. So I'm going to have to rack my brain before I go into the conversation. I should be ready with, here's my personal experience. I was raised in a household where we talked this way and we did this. And so I feel more comfortable with this particular way of politicians comporting themselves. So that it's about our personal experiences. It's not about our opinions.
Right.
And then it doesn't and then the whole goal, and then we can end it, right? Like nobody has to win.
No.
Look, we were in it for 10 minutes over the fence line. I'm like, thanks again for these cookies. They look delicious. And I really appreciate you being so open with me.
Yeah.
I really have enjoyed hearing a little bit more of your story. I hope we can do this again.
Yeah.
We're back to our lives.
The end, but it's so brilliant. It's relational is what it is. So what you're, even in your practice where you said, start by reading through articles that are the ones that you want to push away the most, but practice as you're reading through them, asking yourself the empathy building questions of what would make someone come from that perspective? What are the lived experiences that might have generated this? And then in the conversations that are uncomfy, that you would do the same, that you keep orienting back and how can I build connection with this person and see it from their perspective, the looping, which therapists call that summarizing, paraphrasing, or reflection. But you're right. It's like, I need to keep checking in. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you're saying? Here's what I'm hearing. Is that what you mean? And, that will generate empathy, which comes from feeling heard and seen and understood. And it might even be an invitation to them having, the same curiosity for you and allowing space to hear and see and understand you in a different way. I think that's brilliant, really. So huge takeaways for me are be mindful and do this mindfully so that you're bringing it back into your own agency, your own, like I orient back to me, deciding what I'm going to consume and how I'm going to consume it. And within the context of, generating understanding of places where I'm feeling like I'm in the divisiveness, then I'm going to challenge myself through empathy, that I'm going to build my empathy of what the other side is, which doesn't change necessarily my thoughts, my beliefs, my values. It changes the context. I'm no longer here to have an argument with you for argument's sake. I'm here to have a connection with you, even though we're on two different sides of an issue.
Yeah.
Beautiful. We could talk for hours, Julie. I'm just saying it could happen.
It's been so fun. I agree.
It has been lovely. It has been lovely. Thank you so much for being on the show. Tell my listeners where all they can find your podcast and anything else that you want them to know about.
Absolutely. So the best thing is just to look for Top of Mind with Julie Rose. That's the name of the podcast. And we're on all the platforms. So Apple, Spotify, YouTube, all the things. And you can reach out to me, Top of Mind at byu.edu. If you have, that's my email address. If you've got ideas or if you have questions, and please do stay tuned for our new podcast, which is coming in July. We're launching on July 10th. It'll drop on Wednesdays, called Uncomfy. Sticking with moments that challenge us. So you can find that on all the podcast platforms. It'll be up here in the next little bit as well. And we'll have a trailer, and I'd love to have you give us a follow. And Natalie, I'd love to have you share an uncomfy story with us on the show too. So we'll have to get you on the show
I would
so
love
that all
to
your
share
followers can hear you as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
My pleasure.
Julie. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. That was amazing. And the takeaways that I had were that mindfulness piece, how important that is. That part of what is making us be avoidant of the news and of consuming all of the angstiness from social media and other sources of that news, that part of that is the overwhelm that I'm feeling, and that I get into kind of a survival mode and protective mode with all of it. And so if I mindfully take that entire process back and I start to guide where I attune my attention to, starting from internally checking in with myself and what do I notice as I'm consuming that, media of any kind, news of any kind. That really is part of how I will stay empowered with it. And then on the other side, as I'm having uncomfortable conversations and starting to be knowledgeable and want to have conversations in the world and learn a little bit more about all sides of issues, that empathy is really the key. That if I'm leaning in relationally and connecting with others and have that as the end goal of those uncomfortable conversations, that really is what's going to help elaborate understanding and help me to have just a connection with the person on the other side of the issue instead of the divisiveness of the issues themselves. I hope you took something away today as well, and that it's going to help you get into that centered life thriving. Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I have to make sure at the end of each of these episodes that I give you the disclaimer that none of the material that I talk about in these podcasts is meant to replace any kind of therapy or formal medical or mental health treatment. And in fact, anything that I offer on my website, my coaching programs, any kind of psychoeducational materials that I release are not a replacement for that level of care. So just take that into account when you listen. This is information for you, and hopefully you find it of value, both as an educational tool and for your entertainment. And I also want to mention that if anyone you know is in a mental health crisis, needs additional help, I always include these two crisis resources. They're available to anybody.
Pick up the phone and dial 988 for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline.
And you can always visit their website at suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Additionally, there's actually a crisis text line. So if you're not somebody that likes to pick up the phone,
text HOME, home, to 741-741.
to the crisis text line. And you can find them online at crisistextline.org. Thank you for listening to my podcast. And I hope that you like and follow me wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe consider leaving me a review. It always helps me to keep this podcast relevant when I know what you want to hear about.